Hey, good evening. My name's Rebecca. I'm with the Allegheny County Conservation District, and thanks for joining us for tonight's webinar, Cleaner Water Begins with You. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our website for future views, along with many other of our recorded webinars from earlier this year. If you haven't already, please watch the week's previous webinars with the awesome folks that are looking after our region's water at the Municipal Authority of Westmoreland County and the Allegheny County Sanitary Authority. We will follow up with a message tomorrow containing a link to this webinar and further resources on these topics. This webinar is part 3 of a 3-part public water system series meant to give you a look into the very important processes of sourcing drinking water, treating drinking water, and processing wastewater to provide you with an understanding of your part in improving and protecting water quality. Please feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time, and we will address these at the end of the presentation. I will kick off tonight's presentations with considerations at home, followed by Amy and Riley, who will enlighten us on best management practices for the development in agricultural communities. So I'm going to stop share for a second and bring up my other presentation. Okay, I'm going to walk you through common pollutants we encounter. I'm going to stop my common pollutants we encounter on an everyday basis and changes we can make to reduce our personal contributions to impairing sources of our drinking water. Like many other topics out there, this is a simple introduction to provide you with a bit of background, and I'm sure we're not going to cover everything that's out there. Our work at the Allegheny County Conservation District connects us to source water improvement and protection through our delegated responsibilities and outreach and education activities across Allegheny County by working primarily with the development in agricultural communities, as well as municipalities, the public, and community groups. This webinar series fits right in with our objectives of increasing awareness and understanding of how each of us plugs into improving water quality, so thanks for being here. Thanks to Laura from the Municipal Authority of Westmoreland County for bringing this graphic into my life. This is different from other water cycles that you may have seen because it includes one very important element to accurately reflect the new normal, and that is humans. Humans are a part of the water cycle. What goes down the drain and what runs off the land impacts water quality. This includes what we put in our trash bag and send to the landfill. After water quality drains in your sinks and showers, it goes to a wastewater treatment plant. And from there, the water is released back into the wild where the process repeats itself. The questions to ask your everyday self are, what is going down my drain? What is going in my trash? And what is running off my property? Thanks again to Laura for laying this information out for us in the drinking water webinar from a couple weeks ago. Source water in Allegheny County is majority surface water, aka rivers and streams. The remaining portion is groundwater. Both of these water sources are part of the water cycle. This is the general flow that connects our everyday actions to the water cycle and drinking water. Products we use enter the wastewater treatment system and back into a local waterway, or directly into a local waterway via stormwater runoff. Here's a snapshot of the everyday stuff that can also act as sources of pollution. That's the thing about water quality impacts. It's not just about big industrial manufacturing facilities or energy production. Taking ibuprofen, washing hair, cleaning windows, working in our yards. Unfortunately, all of these everyday actions can negatively impact water quality. Also, full disclosure, I'm nowhere near the level of expert when it comes to the science, research, and full implications of this topic. So if this presentation sparks some in-depth questions, I'll do my best to direct you to the best resource for clear answers. Breaking a PowerPoint presentation cardinal rule of too much text, but this feels too important to paraphrase. People use chemical-based products each day. These chemicals remain in wastewater and beyond because treatment plants weren't designed to take out these chemicals. Similarly, industrial processes that have their own treatment processes don't remove all these chemicals either. Eventually, they end up in the nation's lakes and rivers. So these chemicals are getting into the environment, and we're concerned about the effects they might be having on organisms, including humans. After all, different contaminants have been detected in drinking water supplies, and their risk to our health is still uncertain. I want to say that any mention of chemicals in this presentation is not a statement on either the danger or presence of chemicals in your source water or wastewater effluent. Take the information regarding chemicals as food for thought. We do not necessarily know all impacts, both short and long term, of all the products. And I mention chemicals because they are indeed found in surface water and groundwater. At the end of the day, I think it's likely worth the effort for consumers to not contribute as many chemical additions to the natural environment as we currently are. Okay, first let's talk about a few things you can do outside for water quality. Pollutants of concern outdoors are nutrients and sediment. We presented a deeper dive of each of these pollutants in webinars earlier this year, and I invite you to check them out if you haven't already. Here's a quick lesson. Excess nutrients, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus, are an enormous and costly pollution issue in US waters. In this photo from the Chesapeake Bay program, you can see an algae-loaded waterway, which is one of the consequences of nutrient pollution. So, what's the problem with nitrogen and phosphorus, which are both naturally occurring? You can focus your gaze on the outlined yellow box. Excess nutrient loading impacts everything from recreation to agricultural water supply, which can then lead to adverse health effects and increased costs, including the treatment of drinking water. From the individual level, nutrients are added to the environment largely by yard management and dog waste. The other natural challenge we face due to excess is sediment. Sediment is simply natural material that is broken down, like dirt, gravel, and rocks. It is also the #1 pollutant by volume across waterways in the US. This is a simple chart I put together in an attempt to show a straightforward overview of the impacts of excess sediment. It impacts many things, including our own properties, public properties, infrastructure, aquatic critters, flooding, and the quality of our drinking water. In a developed environment, sediment is no longer just an innocent batch of worn down rocks. It can bind and transport to really harmful stuff, which then gets carried into local waterways through stormwater discharges and overland runoff. This is problematic, both in the short term and the long term. Pollutants can stick around in the beds of waterways for years and years. All living things depend on the quality of the natural environment, including us humans. Streams, rivers, reservoirs, groundwater, they serve as our drinking water sources. What can you do? Anything that you do on your property that slows and ideally absorbs stormwater, as well as keep sediment in place, will help to reduce pollutants entering your local stream. Reducing or eliminating the use of fertilizers and following the application directions will also help to keep the product where it is intended. Another source of nutrient pollution is yard waste. Consider leaving leaves and grass clippings in place as a form of mulch and fertilizer. If your preference is to get them out of sight, or if you live on a property in a dense area where there is nowhere for this stuff to go, try composting it or putting it out for municipal collection program. I live in the city and there's quite literally nowhere for the autumn leaves to go. We have to bag it up for municipal collection. The goal is to keep clippings and leaves out of waterways and the landfill, however it is that you try to accomplish that goal to improve water quality. Be sure to keep dog waste out of waterways. For many of us, a storm drain is not far away, and storm drains lead directly to a local stream or river. When doing any maintenance on your car, from washing it to changing oil, keep storm drains and groundwater in mind. Motor oil and even the type of soap that is used to wash vehicles are sources of pollutants. Avoid maintenance and washing on the street to prevent any risk of fluids entering the storm drain. Lastly, for the great outdoors, a message to folks who own properties with streams. It is so important to allow some level of buffer between property and stream. Allowing vegetation to grow or actively planting trees and shrubs along the stream will undoubtedly help to reduce pollutants from entering the stream, help to filter pollutants, and to keep soil in place. Riparian buffers, or the strip of trees, shrubs, and grasses that run alongside a waterway, are so important that the state of Pennsylvania has set a goal of planting 95,000 acres of buffers by 2025. Okay, now let's move on to some considerations indoors. There are chemicals in all of these everyday items, and they are indeed showing up in wastewater effluent and streams and rivers across the country. Here are some potential health and environmental impacts to consider for common everyday products. How can you help? Properly dispose of any medications, whether they are prescribed or over the counter. The ideal is to find collection events in your community, or check to see if your pharmacy has a drug take-back option. If these aren't available, make the medications unusable by adding in something like cat litter, glue, or coffee grounds, and secure it in a sealed container for the landfill. Remember, we still want to avoid products of concern in landfills because there is a potential for groundwater contamination. Next up, properly recycling items like electronics, paints, styrofoam, and household chemicals. We want to keep these ingredients out of the normal waste stream to avoid contamination of groundwater and soil. As far as electronics, it is actually illegal in the state of Pennsylvania to send to the landfill. The PA Resources Council holds recycling events throughout the year in the Pittsburgh area, and some waste management companies will pick them up from your home a set number of times per year if you make arrangements in advance. If you don't see any of these options available in your area, give your municipality a call and ask if there's a way to get a collection event in your community. Try to use less of these products, consider making or purchasing less toxic products, and use the recommended amount of each product. I'll include a link to the PRC website where you can find a wealth of info on household hazardous waste and other hard to recycle materials. Glass cleaner, bleach, dishwashing soap, laundry detergent, these are all items that contain a lot of extra chemicals that are not necessarily important to get the job done, but contribute stuff potentially making its way into the environment. Consider using white vinegar, baking soda, and store-bought products with fewer ingredients that you can pronounce. I use vinegar and baking soda exclusively in my house as a multi-purpose cleaner, and will only bring out the big chemical guns when I face a pretty big cleaning challenge. Personal care products are all worth considering for both your health and water quality. I learned some really surprising things when I was preparing for this presentation. This is a largely unregulated industry, and if a company does receive health-related complaints, it is not required to share them with the FDA, which further limits our understanding of potential impacts. Try to swap out some of your personal care products for others with simpler ingredients, and try to avoid stuff with fragrances when possible. Plastic is being found in the deepest depths of the ocean nowadays. It is estimated that we all consume plastic on a regular basis. Try to avoid it as much as possible. Refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle. I thought it was important to bring this headline into the spotlight since it's from just a couple weeks ago, and we can feel proud as Pittsburgh area folks to have someone from Pitt involved in this important work. I'll follow up with a link so you can read this article. PFAS, if you're unfamiliar, is a group of chemicals used in a variety of common products. Where can you be exposed to PFAS chemicals at home? Food packaging, household products like nonstick pans and cleaning products, dental floss, and stain and water repellents. There is no simple switch from one type of chemical to another to give products the function that's needed. That goes for many of the other products mentioned in this presentation. A great way to help is to use less and to read up on what you're using. Lastly, get involved in your local watershed group. This is a great way to get involved in projects like water quality monitoring, tree plantings, litter cleanups, and educational events. There are a number of local groups in the area and opportunities to get involved with once we are back to normal. I'll include info on local groups following the presentation. Although this presentation might be a bit overwhelming, there is a positive side to all of this. As the opposite of all of our actions add up for negative impacts, the same principle applies to positive impacts. Use less, properly dispose of and recycle products, consider alternatives, and spend time reading up on stuff. Okay, next up is Amy, who will speak on ACCD's delegated work in the world of construction and how those activities contribute to water quality.
Thanks, Rebecca. Just let me share my screen. Okay, so as Rebecca said, I'm going to talk about sediment and source water. I'm Amy Millers. I'm the watershed specialist at the Allegheny County Conservation District. So let's first talk about the basics when it comes to earth disturbance. Like, what is earth disturbance? So simply put, it's any construction or human activity that disturbs the surface of the land. So this includes a lot of activities, such as clearing and grubbing, grading, excavation, constructing embankments, land development and building activities, paving, landscaping, and any other moving, depositing, stockpiling, and storing of soil, rock, and earth materials. So how does that impact source water? These activities remove the soil's protective cover and change the characteristics of the soil itself, runoff patterns, and stream flow characteristics. The protective vegetation is reduced or eliminated, topsoil is removed and stockpiled, and cuts and fill are made, which alter the topography and runoff characteristics at a site. So surrounding properties, as well as receiving streams, can be adversely affected even by projects of limited size by uncontrolled runoff and sediment pollution, which can impact public and private facilities and water supplies and increase the cost of water filtration on public drinking water. From large projects to home landscaping, if soils are left exposed, it can make its way to a water source. As Rebecca previously mentioned, sediment is the #1 pollutant by volume, according to the EPA. So, as a result of this, each state has regulatory requirements for earth disturbance activities. In Pennsylvania, these requirements can be found under Title 25, Environmental Protection. It contains all of the Commonwealth's environmental regulations, and it's organized by chapter. Chapter 102 deals with erosion control regulations and covers both erosion control requirements and stormwater management requirements. The authority for these regulations, as in the actual law passed by the legislature, comes from the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law. The Clean Streams Law originally passed in 1937 and has been amended several times since, but the purpose is to preserve and improve the purity of the waters of the Commonwealth for public health, animal and aquatic life, industrial consumption, and recreation. So what exactly does 102 regulate? Chapter 102 regulates earth disturbance and requires persons conducting earth disturbance to implement best management practices to minimize accelerated erosion and manage post-construction stormwater. Best management practices are activities, facilities, measures, planning, or procedures that help minimize accelerated erosion and manage post-construction stormwater. And we'll talk about some specific examples in a minute. But generally, once earth disturbance is 5,000 square feet or greater, a written plan is required under the regulations. This is just under 1/8 of an acre, or approximately the size of a football field end zone. That's the yellow square you see in the picture, not the whole field. If earth disturbance increases to 1 acre or more, a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit, is required. And each of those types of plans have different requirements by the state to control erosion. So the main takeaway is that no matter the size of the earth disturbance, best management practices are required and should be used. So this can be as simple as seeding and mulching right after a small home project, or putting up silt fence down slope of a small driveway grading project. BMPs are needed for any earth disturbance activities. Work in and around streams has its own set of requirements under Title 25. These requirements are found in Chapter 102, Dam Safety and Waterways Management. Essentially, this chapter regulates construction in streams, in and around streams, the 100-year floodway, wetlands, and other bodies of water. Chapter 105 regulates obstructions and encroachments, and these come in a wide variety of project types, such as bridges, utility lines, dams, docks and marinas, retaining walls, flood control projects, and the list goes on. Subchapters in the 105 regulations set forth regulatory requirements for different project types. Generally, projects fall into two permit types. General permits are projects that are similar in nature and can be adequately regulated with a standardized set of specifications and conditions. These include projects like utility line stream crossings, stream stabilization up to 500 feet in length, small docks, temporary crossings, and minor road crossings, to name a few. Projects that don't meet the criteria for a general permit will need to get a joint permit that will be reviewed by DEP as well as the Army Corps of Engineers. For more information on permitting requirements, ACCD has a host of resources on our website, and if you have questions about what you can do in and around your stream, I would encourage you to start there and contact one of our regulatory team members. I'll provide a really good handout that DEP put out on StreamWork as part of our follow-up email as well. So now I want to show you some common BMPs that are used to prevent sediment and erosion from leaving a site. DEP provides a manual on these BMPs. It's over 550 pages, but I just want to show you some of the common ones, as well as things to look for that may present impacts to waterways. So we'll start with site access BMPs, which are typically installed in preparation of, and to prep the site to allow for equipment, trucks, and materials to be brought on site. The most common site access BMP is a rock construction entrance. It uses rocks to get the mud off the tires prior to driving on a roadway. These BMPs do have maintenance requirements, and they should be cleaned regularly so that mud is not tracked onto the roadway. If it does get onto roadway, it can enter storm sewers and be discharged to streams. So if you look at this picture, this entrance should be cleaned and new rock applied. Access roads should have a stable base that is able to shed water to either a vegetated area or another BMP for treatment. If you look at this access road, it obviously does neither of those things, and during a rain event would cause erosion and sedimentation issues. Finally, some access roads use things like water bars or deflectors, like this one you can see in the picture, to carry water off the road surface, typically to a vegetated area or another BMP. So let's look at some common sediment barriers and filters. Compost filter sock is probably the most common. It allows water to flow through while trapping sediment on the upstream side. But again, it has to be maintained. So you'll notice the bottom picture has all the sediment built up behind it. That has to get removed in order for the BMP to work properly. Water would just flow over that compost filter sock at this point. Silt fence is probably second most common. It functions pretty much the same way as compost sock. There's different sizes for different slopes. The thing with with silt fence is it needs to be buried in the ground or trenched in to function. So these two pictures will not work. You can see the boot underneath, so that is obviously not trenched in, and just putting rocks on top of the bottom will not suffice. It has to be dug into the ground. Sediment basins are sized for larger areas. Runoff is directed to the basin where the water is stored while sediment settles out over time. Clean water is then released. And these also have to be cleared out at a certain elevation. So typically you'll see a stake somewhere in the sediment basin that has an elevation marked on it when it needs to be cleaned out. And lastly, during construction, inlets that receive any kind of runoff from exposed soil should have an inlet filter bag. It sits inside their inlet. You can see kind of the post there and the outside of it. And that lets clean water through and traps the sediment within the bag. But if it's not maintained, they can clog and back up water onto roadways like you see here. So the last type of BMP is stabilization, which is the ultimate goal in decreasing pollution. So exposed soils should be seeded and mulched as soon as work is completed in any given area. You can see this has been adequately seeded and mulched, and ultimately we want the vegetation to grow back and look like this. Sometimes slopes require other products to be used, such as erosion control blankets to keep seed in place. And those are some common BMPs that you would see on construction sites, but how can you help as a resident? Simply knowing where your source water protection area is can be beneficial. Laura provided some resources in her presentation about where you can find that information. If you're planning any type of project, be it small or large, you should be aware of the regulations that I talked about and use the BMPs mentioned in the presentation. And always, always stabilize any soils as soon as possible. Work in and around a surface water or a wetland may require a permit, so check in with ACCD or your local conservation district if you have questions. And finally, if you see something at a site that is causing sediment pollution, you should contact your local conservation district or DEP. Last year, you can see there ACCD performed almost 1,000 site inspections and complaint investigations. There are over 800 active permits for sediment, erosion and sediment control permits. So if you see something out there, say something. It's a big county and we are a small staff. And with that, I will turn it over to Riley, who is going to talk about some agricultural conservation practices.
Thanks, Amy. Good evening, everyone. Happy to see some folks on with us. My name is Riley Sunday, and I'm the agriculture conservationist at the district. So I focus on working with farmers and other folks in the county who own livestock to make sure that we are keeping manure and fertilizer nutrients out of our waterways. So some of you might be familiar, but I'm going to talk a little bit about ag and its impact on source water. So like Rebecca mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution are a big deal in our waterways, and a lot of this pollution comes from manure and fertilizer nutrients. When they are applied to fields in the wrong amounts or too close to streams, sometimes there's runoff, sometimes the nutrients just aren't being absorbed by the crops and aren't infiltrating into the soil. That is when we have issues with heavy storm flows washing those nutrients into wells, into surface waters, and in some cases leaching down into the water table. So that leads into the how, which is the runoff from backyards, the over application of manure or fertilizers, and leaching nutrients from things like manure stacks. Sometimes if a manure stack is sitting in a field for too long, those nutrients and having the rainwater infiltrate down through the stack can lead to nutrients getting into the water table. This is particularly a problem when fields or areas have low vegetative cover. It can be a problem in the winter, which we like to think of as any time when the ground is frozen, when the ground is snow covered, and also any time between December 15th and February 28th. This happens close to surface waters like streams, lakes, and ponds, but also can happen near wells. Those can be public wells or private wells. In order to prevent this kind of nutrient contamination from ag, there are three main strategies that farmers and folks engaged in agriculture can use to prevent this kind of contamination. So the first one is to avoid contamination altogether. The second is to do what we call keeping clean water clean. And the third is treatment or mitigation. So the first is to avoid contamination. And this sounds pretty simple, but it's not always so easy. So to avoid would be excluding high-risk areas for contamination, such as streams and wells. And that includes having setbacks when you're spreading manure, but also excluding these areas from access to animals. In this picture, we have some stream bank fencing. So you can see up in the top right corner a little bit of pasture fencing there, so the animals can be inside the pasture, but they're not coming down into this stream area, and so we don't risk as much manure getting into the stream. Manure setbacks, we have a couple different kinds. So there are two main programs that regulate manure nutrients in Pennsylvania, and they are Act 38, which is for higher concentration animal operations, and then Chapter 91, which is for anyone who owns a chicken or a goat or a sheep or a cow or a horse. All of these animals that are considered livestock in Pennsylvania also fall under manure regulations. So these setbacks are for mechanical manure application. So when you're plowing manure into a field or tilling the soil, incorporating raw manure into the earth. And a good rule of thumb is at least 100 feet from an open water source. This is a chart from the regulations that shows, different kinds of sensitive areas like streams, lakes, and ponds, sinkholes, wells, and the required minimum setback. The second strategy or best management practice for ag operators is to divert water. And that's what we call keeping clean water clean. So rain that is coming down onto the operation, that's clean water because it hasn't yet been contaminated with manure or fertilizer nutrients. And so making sure that that clean water doesn't run through a possibly contaminated area is really important. One of the ways that farmers do that is by installing gutters on their barns, especially areas over top of a barnyard like how you see here. All of the rain that comes down would be hitting that red roof and washing over this bare area that has, understandably, animal manure. We've got a happy little sheep sitting over here. But the gutter allows for that clean stormwater to be captured and released outside of this contaminated area. Another way that farmers can divert clean water is by installing a berm or a diversion on an upslope area from a barnyard or an area where animals spend so much time that vegetation is not able to fully establish. Another strategy is covering permanent manure piles or manure stacks. And for some people, this looks like having a permanent structure like a roof or a designed manure storage. But for others, this could be as simple as covering manure stacks with tarps. This ensures that the storm water, this clean water, isn't coming and infiltrating down through the manure pile and leaching or potentially leaching manure nutrients into the water table. The third strategy is to mitigate, and that is using strategies to treat or prevent runoff before it reaches water sources. So one of the ways that we can do that is with a vegetative treatment area. So you have your barnyard, and then where the water exits the barnyard after it's flowed through, it can go through a vegetated area. And these areas have specific requirements, but the idea is that the manure nutrients will flow through the vegetation and be captured better than if they were flowing through a bare area. There's also a strategy called the 4Rs method when applying manure and fertilizer nutrients, and I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. But another really popular strategy is using ground cover and cover crops. Making sure that soil isn't bare helps to lock in sediment, which we've also talked about as a pollutant for waterways, and the nutrients, and gives them a place to go when we're not in the peak of the growing season. This is a picture of red clover, which is one of the most popular cover crops in Pennsylvania. So this 4Rs method is really critical because it's all about using the right source at the right rate, at the right time, in the right place. So what does this mean? The right source means that when we are selecting nutrients and fertilizer, we're picking the right combination of nutrients to make sure that the plant is getting what it needs and isn't having an over application of nutrients that could then leach off and run off into waterways. Sometimes this is manure, but sometimes the chemical composition of manure isn't really the right source of fertilizer or nutrient for a particular crop. The right rate means applying these nutrients at the appropriate amount to avoid overwhelming the crop with more than it can use. The right time means that we apply these nutrients at the right time in the plant's growth cycle so that they can be utilized when the crops need them most. This is really important when you think about spreading manure in the winter, for example. Sometimes farms have so much manure that they need to spread year round. But spreading manure in the winter, you're not applying this manure nutrient at a time when the plants can really be utilizing it. And so you're just increasing the risk for those nutrients to run off. The right place is making sure that the nutrients are on or near the crops where they'll be best absorbed by the plant roots. There are a lot of ways that you can help, and if you are a farmer and you have livestock and you want to talk with me more about ways that we can look at conservation and manure on your operation, I'm more than happy to talk to you about that. If you're a farmer, you should contact your county conservation district for information about best management and conservation practices. It's also important to educate yourself on the locations of active wells, the depth of the water table, and surface waters. Knowing the depth of the water table can be important because if you have a high water table, then you know that if there is a manure stack on your property, it needs to be moved much more frequently than if the water table is more shallow. Also, you should report instances of pollution to your local conservation district. One of the things we do is respond to complaints related to manure. So, if you see a manure pile that looks like it has runoff, or there are animals getting in the stream in a way that looks really unmanaged, those are the kinds of things that we can then go to the landowner and work through some solutions for them. We currently have 6 farms in Allegheny County who participate in the Act 38 Nutrient Management Program. And this is a really important program that helps regulate the manure nutrients and make sure they're being utilized appropriately. But we also offer other technical assistance to these farms to help them install best management practices and conservation practices on their farms. This year alone, we've helped develop 6 other manure management plans. It's been a very popular year for backyard chickens. And even if you might not think much about a little bit of chicken manure, it's still an important nutrient source to consider, especially when we think about chicken manure in the city and how interconnected our stormwater systems are. We don't want to run into a situation where chicken manure ends up in storm drains and then ends up contaminating drinking water. So it's important to think about all those things. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, or if there are other questions from earlier in the presentation, we'd be happy to answer those as well.
Thanks, Riley. It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat, so we'll just provide these last few moments to give you the opportunity to ask a question. Otherwise, we're really grateful for you all taking the time out to listen to us tonight, and please feel free to get in touch with any one of us at any point.